What are the commonalities among leaders who sustain excellence over an extended period of time?
David, it's great to have you back on the Learning Leaders Show, man. Welcome.
My pleasure to be back. Thanks for inviting me.
Sure. I read recently something that you said about mentors, and I wanted to start there because this is something I think as I was building my career, I obsessed over, and I think you might have a counter view. What's your thought process on mentors and the importance or lack thereof when it comes to them?
I think mentors, if they're very good, can be very helpful. I think role models can be helpful as well, even if they're not mentoring you.
Mm-hmm.
I have not been a very good mentor in my own case because I've always felt I didn't have enough time to mentor other people, though people tell me that I've mentored them, but I didn't really realize I was doing that. I would say I didn't have any real mentors. I had people I looked up to and some people I thought were role models, but I can't say there was somebody that was obsessively, compulsively, working to make sure that I rose up to be something useful.
I know it's a big question, but given your background, we can dig into it. You've absolutely sustained excellence over an extended period of time. If you had to deconstruct some of the big moves and decisions you made, I mean, and mentors, it sounds like, and people above you were not part of that. What are a few of the keys, whether they're choices, actions, behaviors on your part that helped you build this multi-billionaire lifestyle for yourself?
Well, my lifestyle is not quite as luxurious as you might think. I spend more time working than I do enjoying the pleasures of any money I might have. But anyway, I enjoy working more than I probably do enjoying luxury, so-called. In any event, I would say if I look back at my life, there were probably 4 key decisions that helped me move to where I am today. One was the decision to go to law school and to get involved in government and politics, and that was my interest. Second was to take a decision to try to get a job in the Carter White House and work there. Third was to start Carlyle. And fourth was to get involved actively as a philanthropist when I realized I was making a fair amount of money and doing it in a way where I could be seen as and actually do things that help the country. So, leaving aside children and other kinds of personal things, I would say those are the kind of key decisions I made that have given me the greatest good fortune.
Were you a good lawyer?
No, I was a terrible lawyer. I did reasonably well in law school, well enough to go to the law review, which means you're probably in the top part of the class. But to be a great lawyer, you have to be obsessive compulsive about details. You have to have an unbelievable commitment to your clients. You have to have a specialization. You have to narrow your focus to just very few things. And I wasn't good at that. I tended to look at the bigger picture. I tended not to be obsessive about the details. So I was not a good lawyer, and my clients reminded me of that all the time.
What'd they say?
Well, they just said, "Why do you want to practice law?" and so forth. No, I was a young lawyer for 2 years, and right out of law school. So nobody really made a big difference. Everybody's fungible as a young lawyer, and I just worked hard, and you'd stay out of trouble. But when I left the White House, I had to go back and practice law, and I'd only practiced law for 2 years. I really didn't have an expertise, and so I was just kind of fumbling around trying to look for clients or figuring out what to do. To be a great lawyer, you have to have a focus and have a specialty, and I didn't really want to specialize in any one thing because I thought it would cut me off from doing other things in life. So I really wasn't a good lawyer, and I wish I had been better at it, but I wasn't. If I had been a great lawyer, maybe I would have stayed at it, and therefore maybe I wouldn't have done anything else in life. So I don't regret not being a great lawyer.
So you leave that and eventually start the Carlyle Group, and this goes on and still is one of the most impactful and most excellent investment firms in history. Hundreds of billions of dollars that Carlyle Group's managing. I mean, again, this could be hours worth of a conversation, but what was it about the fact that made you not good as a lawyer, in your words, that then made you world class when it comes to starting the Carlyle Group?
Well, as a lawyer, I didn't have a specialty. I didn't really like it. And to be really good at something, you have to like it. When I started a company, I realized this was kind of my baby. And if it succeeded, it would be in part because of what I did, though I had very good partners to help me. And I just fell in love with the idea of building something from scratch and making it a global organization. What enabled Carlyle to grow was we had a very good track record, but it wasn't only that. I had two ideas that changed the face of private equity. They're not worthy of a Nobel Prize or anything, but they changed private equity a bit. Historically, private equity was a mom and pop business. You had a small buyout fund, a small venture fund, and so forth. I had the idea of having our business that had multiple funds. In other words, a buyout fund, a venture fund, a growth capital fund, and basically do what Vanguard or T. Rowe Price or Fidelity had done, offer our investors a multiple selection of alternative kind of investments. And then the second idea was to globalize it by running around the world and building organizations that were comparable to what we had in the US, but do them in Japan or Asia or Middle East, Europe, and so forth. That had not been done before. So the idea of having multiple funds and in fact institutionalizing the business, not making a mom and pop, and then globalizing it. That's what I did, and that's what I spent about 30 years of my life doing.
How did you think of this since it wasn't done before? Everything when you look back, you're like, oh yeah, it's obvious. Like every innovation, everything that people do, you look back and it looks obvious. They're never obvious at the start because it's never been done before. What was it that about you that was able to see almost the future, see around corners to start something that had never been done before?
If you're very successful at something, you generally don't have time to think about things. Great ideas don't come from people that are busy with major responsibilities. Generally, the greatest ideas in the world will come from people who don't have as much else to do, or they're thinking out of the box. Now, some venture capitalists will never give money to people who have been in a given industry. If they want to change an industry, they want to get somebody who's not been in the industry. They ask questions that nobody ever thought of who was in the industry. In my case, I didn't have a history of investing. I didn't have a history of private equity investing. And I was therefore approaching things with a novel perspective, asking questions that hadn't been asked before by people that had more experience than me. So I'm not saying that what I came up with was such a brilliant thing that changed the face of the world, but it did help change private equity. And Blackstone and KKR and Apollo no doubt would have gotten the same place anyway eventually, but they kind of followed the same model, in many cases doing it better than we did. But the motto of having a large, global, institutionalized firm was a novel thing at the time.
You, before we started recording, David, I said, do you prefer asking the questions or answering the questions, being the interviewer or interviewee? Because you have interviewed world-class leaders for many years, and you, like me, said, oh, I far prefer being the interviewer, and I would agree. What is it about you that loves interviewing and asking questions of other excellent leaders?
Well, I guess I have an intellectual curiosity like you do, and therefore I'm always interested in learning things. I'm reading all the time, trying to find out as much new information as possible. As I look back on it, my mother, we would say that I was a yenta. Yenta is a Jewish word or Yiddish word for trying to know everybody's business. So, don't pay attention to other people's business, my mother would say, worry about your own business. But I like to ask people how they got where they are. And I'm always interested how they overcame problems in their life. How do I compare with what they did? And so I'm always curious, and I like to ask questions. And it turned out that the way I like to ask questions, people like to listen to or watch. So it turned out to be a marriage made in heaven. The reason I like asking questions more is that it's harder to screw up asking questions than answering questions. If you ask a question, generally you don't get in as much trouble. If you answer a question wrong, you can get in trouble. So I prefer to avoid that by asking the questions.
How do you prepare for an interview?
If I'm interviewing an author of a book, I think it's appropriate to read the book. So I always read the book. If the person hasn't written a book, then I will go through and get compiled for me by a research assistant that I use all the things on the internet that are out there about the person. If he or she's done interviews, whatever their background is. And then what I'll do is I'll just digest all this stuff. And then after a couple hours of reading it, I will then write up questions that I would like to ask, and then I kind of memorize the questions, but I kind of, it's not that hard to do. And then that's how I prepare. But I'm always looking for, things that would provide some humor, because I think some humor sometimes in my style works. So I'm always looking for something that might add a touch of humor to it to make the interview a little bit more interesting.
How many of your questions are pre-scripted versus follow-up in the moment, a response to something they said, like percentage-wise?
I would say about 80% are things I thought of in advance, or so, maybe 85%. And then about 10 to 15% are things that I didn't realize the person was going to say, and then I play off of that, and then try to always think of something maybe somewhat funny or witty that might, come along as a result of what the person said. But when I use humor, I never use humor at the expense of a person. So there's some people like to make fun of other people. That isn't my style. I generally make fun of myself or so forth. So I think I don't risk, ever embarrassing a person. I'm not Mike Wallace at 60 Minutes in his heyday. I'm not trying to embarrass people. I'm trying to have an interesting conversation. I want people to be willing to be interviewed by me. And once I get a reputation for not embarrassing people, it's not that difficult to get people to do the interviews. So I would say generally I do prepare, but I always want to be flexible and be able to move the conversation in a way that the person would like. In fact, Oprah Winfrey, when I interviewed her, she said she wasn't that good an interview in her view, but she was a really good listener. And the trick is listening to what somebody says and then playing off of it.
It's funny, David, I was doing some research recently on transformational relationships, and it started, those usually evolved into were friendships, people who were good friends. And one of the themes that's kept coming up after a wide variety of interviews, this is off microphone, was that of laughter and humor. Transformational people seem to laugh a lot together. They did other things too. They learned together, they did hard things together, but they also laughed a lot, and the humor came up far more than I expected. And you just brought it up here too, that's something you try to do. I've noticed that in your interview process. Can you talk more about humor with relationships and friendships in your life? Because I would be curious to see what like your social life is like outside of the philanthropic world, outside of you interviewing, when it comes to humor.
Well, I think humor tends to break tensions between people, and it can tend to produce a common bond. When you can laugh together, you're more likely to get something done than when you're fighting with each other and you can't laugh together. So I think everyone likes to figure out a way to kind of make a joke here and there. Everybody thinks they have a sense of humor. And to the extent that you actually have a good sense of humor and you can make other people feel at ease, I think it eases the conversation and actually probably produces friendships. Particularly my own style tends to be self-deprecating humor a fair bit. I guess I got it when I was watching John Kennedy at his press conferences when I was a boy. He had a really good sense of humor and about himself. And I think that takes a fair amount of security. Some people who make fun of other people probably are insecure. When I was probably insecure when I was younger, but as I've gotten older and become more successful, I'm relatively secure about my position in life, and therefore I can make a lot of fun of myself and not feel that it's going to diminish my stature in the world by making fun of myself.
And you've written, last time we talked about How to Lead, a book you've written, and you've got a new one out that really I enjoyed reading through the different stories and different people. It's called The American Experiment: Dialogues on a Dream. And if you're cool with it, I'd like to dive into specific people and concepts from the book and ask for you to expand on them, and maybe we could talk about them. I mentioned to you before, I live in Dayton, Ohio. The Wright Brothers bicycle shop was down the street from where I currently live. And you've talked to David McCullough, who wrote, I think, the definitive book on the Wright Brothers. It's called The Wright Brothers. He's a great storyteller. He's a historian. And I'm curious, from your perspective and conversations, what do you think was the key to the Wright Brothers' success?
Well, David McCullough would say the key was that even though they didn't have college degrees, they had books in their house Their father always insisted that they read, and they read enormous amounts of not engineering books, but social sciences, history, literature. And it was that inquiring mind, that ability to kind of think outside of the box, that he would say is what made them so successful. When you think about it, they had spent less than $1,000 of their own money to be able to prove that man could fly and land safely. And everybody who had better educations in aeronautical engineering and so forth couldn't do this. No one had ever done it before. And they did it with a modest amount of money. And just basically they were bicycle shop operators and not trained as aeronautical engineers. So I think it was their inquiring mind, and also their persistence, low ego. They weren't focused on getting enormous amounts of credit. They really weren't focused on money, honestly. They later built some companies, but money wasn't their main focus in life. I'd say it was, a passion to prove a point. And that is usually what you find in entrepreneurs who are successful, a passion to prove that their idea works. And that's what makes great companies, really. It's an entrepreneur pushing it. And that's what they did as well.
David, do you advise leaders within companies? Is that part of your work, or is that just kind of on the side for fun? Or do you ever like have these meetings where they'll bring you in or have a Zoom call with you to get to help get advice for leaders within companies?
Well, in the companies that Carlyle runs and owns, I do meet many of the CEOs, but I wouldn't say they're looking to me for advice, particularly. Sometimes when it gets to public policy matters or leadership matters or things that are maybe outside of their real domain as running a particular company, they might ask me for some advice. And I find that, sometimes I have something useful to say and sometimes I have nothing useful to say. Generally, I would say, I do give a lot of speeches on leadership and things like that. And some people may listen, some people may not. I would say that usually younger people are probably more interested in what I have to say than older people.
Really? Why?
Because younger people are always looking for people who are role models, people that have achieved something. And sometimes now, because of what I've been doing in philanthropy or business or other things, people will say, well, how did he get where he got? And I would say, well, I got a lot of luck. And I just kind of talk about the attributes that are helpful. But I wouldn't say that the CEOs of the world are calling me up and asking me for day-to-day business advice, because I'm not really that great at running a business of the type that they're running.
How would you define excellent leadership? What are the behaviors of an excellent leader? An
excellent leader is somebody that has a vision of where he or she wants to go. They are determined to walk through walls to get there. They're determined to be able to influence the people that have to follow them. You have to be a leader to have followers, and you have to be able to communicate with them either by oral means or written means or by leading by example. I think an excellent leader is somebody that also has some humility, also is a person who is highly ethical, also a person who is not interested in getting all the credit for him or herself, but is willing to share the credit, and a person that has higher goals about what life is all about than just making money or just building an organization and patting themselves on the back. So they have a perspective on something more important than just the organization they might be leading. But I also think a certain humanity is helpful. Now, as I probably talked about before, some great leaders were not exactly humble. Charlemagne probably wasn't humble. Alexander the Great probably wasn't humble. Julius Caesar probably wasn't humble. And I doubt that Napoleon was humble. But there are a lot of people who are humble that were great leaders, Abraham Lincoln being a classic example.
Yeah, I love studying when it comes to Lincoln. When you think about your life and what you've been able to accomplish, do you regularly sit back and reflect and go, wow, this is crazy? Or are you more heads down looking forward type of a person?
Well, first of all, despite your kind words about me and what other people might have said, I don't really think I've accomplished as much as I would have liked to accomplish. I realize all the mistakes I made. Well, sure. There are people that have made more money than me, have had more impact on the world, built other companies. And so I'm always comparing myself to other people. And so I always think that, why didn't I do this better?
Why do you do that? Why do you do that?
Well, maybe it's because I don't think I'm that great. And relatively speaking, I wish I was smarter, more successful, harder working.
I'm talking about like the comparison to other people, though. Isn't that kind of a recipe to not feel very good?
Well, maybe it keeps one humble, because if you're thinking you're so great, then you're going to try to brag about how you've done. I don't think it's a useful thing. So I think in the end, my mother used to say, don't fish for compliments. Don't run around telling people how great you are and asking them to tell you how great you are. Do what you're supposed to do. And if other people think you've done a good job, fine, but don't be the one out there telling people how great you are. And I think, when I look at people who have built much greater companies than anything I've ever done, or been much better philanthropists, or much better in so many things, I just, I realized that I've had more success than I deserved, more than I ever thought I would have, but much less than I would wish I would have had.
I want to ask you about goal setting, because this is something I personally struggle with, David. What is your goal setting process? Do you set goals? Do you crush them? Do you have you set them in the past? I'm just curious your overall philosophy on goal setting.
Well, I do try to have goals where I'm saying, oh, this is what I want to accomplish in the business world. This is what I want to accomplish in the philanthropic world. I don't usually write them out, because they'll look stupid by comparison in a few years if you don't probably achieve them. But I do have in my own mind what I want to like to do. And I don't like to talk about them too much in advance, because if you talk about the goals you have for yourself, you might sound like you're bragging too much, or you're trying to do too much, or people will think you're unrealistic. So I would say set publicly modest goals and try to exceed them. And that would probably be a better approach. I don't really publicly, when I go talk about my goal, if I had said at the beginning, I'm going to build a global private equity firm that's going to be one of the largest in the world, people would have thought I was crazy. And so I wouldn't have said that.
Was that a goal, though? Was that a real goal?
Well, I didn't think it would be as big as it turned out to be, but I did want to make it something more than a 6-person firm. But I didn't want to say publicly, guess what? We're going to be one of the biggest in the world. People would laugh at me.
What's wrong with that? People probably laughed at the Wright Brothers, don't you think?
They probably did. I'm sure people are laughing behind my back all the time. But, I just didn't want to basically make a fool of myself by saying things that people would say, look, you don't know anything about business. You worked in the Carter White House. It didn't get reelected. I mean, come on, let's be realistic. You're lucky you got a job as a lawyer.
Yeah. What's a current secret big goal, ambition? Maybe one you could share. I saw pictures of you hanging out in Alaska. Sound like a big project. I mean, what's going on?
Well, for Alaska, I'm filming a PBS series on American historic icons. That one was on the bald eagle. So I had to trek all the way to a place called Haines, Alaska, where bald eagles descend in the enormous numbers. And I was, learning about them and trying to help with the narration of it. But I would say right now, my goals are to try to not do anything that's going to get me in public trouble. In other words, I've given away a lot of scholarships to people, and I have my name on buildings these days. And I always say to people, look, I'll have a Faustian bargain with you. I won't embarrass you. Try not to embarrass me. So I have scholarships, and people are saying they're the David Rubenstein Scholar, David Rubenstein Professor, Fellow. Well, I don't want to then have them want to take their name away from the thing by do something wrong. So I'm trying to be very careful about not doing anything that embarrasses anybody. So I am cautious in that respect, but I am trying to, give away the bulk of my money in an intelligent way. I'm trying to have 3 children who are able to live very happy and healthy lives without me being around, because eventually I won't be around. I'm trying to have people think that I did something useful with my life. And one of the best ways of doing that is giving back to the country. So a lot of my philanthropy is what I call patriotic philanthropy, giving back to the country. But in the end, I hope that people will think that I, did something useful on the face of the earth, and, time will tell.
Are you more nervous today than you were maybe 10 years ago about saying something that may make people want to take your names off the buildings?
Probably, because I've put my name on buildings now, and people say, well, why do you do that? Well, I guess I've done it for a couple of reasons. When my parents were alive, they certainly took pleasure in it. I was their only child. But I guess the way I do it, and I'm not saying that I'm a person with no ego, but it is that if somebody from modest circumstances, as I came from, could achieve what I've been able to achieve, even though people have achieved much more, And people might say, well, Rubenstein, look what he did, and his name's on this building, and he came from modest circumstances. It might inspire other people from modest circumstances to do the same thing. So, but once you have your name on things, you have scholarships named after you, buildings named after you. If you do something publicly embarrassing, what's going to happen? So I have to be very cautious and careful to not do anything that's ever going to get me in any kind of trouble. Sometimes I've done things that people criticize. Recently, I lent my home for the holidays to President Biden. It was in the press. I didn't think it was a big deal. He had borrowed it before, and I've known him for a long time. So he has a tradition of going to Thanksgiving in Nantucket. It was a 40-year tradition. So when he was vice president, I lent him my house a couple of times. It wasn't a big deal. This time, I lent him my house, and I wasn't there. He had members of his family there, and he enjoyed it, had a good time. But I was criticized by lots of people in the newspapers for saying, "How could you do this?" And well, they were saying, in effect, I guess you shouldn't be letting him use your house. I wasn't quite clear to me. There are a lot of people on the, let's say, the conservative side of the spectrum. The New York Post had cartoons or something about it, and just making fun of me, but for doing something like this, I guess. But anyway, but I'm not upset about it. I just think you have to recognize that if you get more visible, people are always going to find something wrong with you. But generally, I'm trying to be a person that my children are not going to be embarrassed about, and that my friends won't be embarrassed about, and people I've given money to won't be embarrassed about things I've done.
At the beginning of your book, there's talk about a Benjamin Franklin quote, "A republic, if you can keep it." What did he mean by that, and why was that important to be in the book?
When he was leaving the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin was asked by a prominent woman, "What kind of government have you given us, Dr. Franklin?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." By that, he meant republics are not easy to keep. And so we've given you a country with a government that has a kind of democracy to it, not complete democracy, a representative democracy, a republic. But he wasn't clear in his own mind whether the country could actually make it work. Nothing like that had ever happened before. There had never been people coming together and said, we're going to create a government, not with an autocrat or not with a king running it, but with representative democracy. That had never happened before, really. And so he wasn't clear whether it could happen. And I started the book with it because this book is about the history of our country and how we had such great rhetoric and intentions at the beginning. All men are created equal and so forth. But we've really struggled over the 250 years of the country's history to kind of live up to the rhetoric when, in fact, we've had a lot of challenges. We've had slavery. We didn't let women vote. We still have lots of discrimination against people. So it's been a kind of story about how we treated certain people in our society, people who are Native Americans, people who are African Americans, people who are women, and all the other challenges that we've had in building this country.
I read that you said your hope is that readers will be inspired to help lead the way to continued progress and thereby avoid the historical fate of other countries that also at times were once the envy of the world. I guess like we are, or like we are maybe to some. Can you say more about that?
Sure. For, in the 1700s and 1800s, the dominant country in the world was England. And England is a wonderful place and so forth, but it's not the dominant country that it once was. And so therefore you have to recognize that, it's inevitable that sometimes civilizations don't continue to be as robust as they once were. We all know about the ancient Greek and Roman empires. They survived for many, many years, Roman Empire for hundreds of years, but didn't survive forever. The Ottoman Empire, and many other countries around the world. And China was the dominant country, the largest economy in the world up until probably the 1600s. And then it went into a period where it wasn't as dominant. Now it's coming back to greater dominance. But, civilizations come and go. And it's unlikely that we will 300, 400, 500 years from now be as dominant as we are today.
Do you think we're in trouble right now based on what's going on in our country?
Well, there's clearly a divide in the country between let's say the conservatives and the liberals, there are different phrases you could use for those groupings, but the country is unable to govern itself and as effectively as we should. Basically, the Congress is reflecting the country, and we can barely, keep the government alive. We have problems keeping the debt limit passed and so forth. And so you don't have Democrats and Republicans talking to each other very much. It's not a very pleasant place in Congress right now or in Washington, D.C., compared to some other times in our history. So clearly, we are governing in a way that many people around the world say, you are the model of democracy. Well, we don't think so anymore.
What would you do if they brought you in as a consultant to help?
Well, I would think that's unlikely, but I would say the most.
I mean, you just lent your house to the president. I mean, maybe not.
I would say the principal problems we have, and I can't solve these problems, are money is so important in politics that there's no limit in how much you can give to politicians, and therefore they're always out there raising money for lots of reasons. One, it helps their campaigns, it scares off opponents. You can keep the money after you leave office for political purposes. So many members are raising money, and to raise money, you have to appeal to the far left or the far right. And the result is you tend to have people not really appealing to the middle. And working out compromises is not things that helps raise money or helps you on your social media network. So that's a big, big problem. I don't have a solution for it, as long as the law is that people can give as much money as they want. I wish that wasn't the law, and I wish we had constraints on how much money you can give, but that doesn't seem to be possible.
Don't you think, I feel like when I travel around the world and get to do cool things, or even just within the country, and I meet people, I find that most people are kind of towards the middle. You know what I mean? Like you mentioned far left and far right. It seems like when I come across people, great people, and they just seem to kind of go towards that way. Like, is that your experience? Or I'm curious, you run in different circles than I do. Like, what's your experience?
Well, remember, you've got 7.5 billion people on the face of the earth, and you and I are probably meeting with a narrow segment of people, who are probably the kind of people that gravitate to what we do. There are people on the far right and the far left who aren't likely to be people that are going to be interested in meeting you or me, maybe more you than me, but they won't, so I think you have to recognize that. And also, a lot of people are not happy with their lives, and people don't generally look in the mirror and say, I'm going to blame myself. It's my own fault. They generally blame other people. And when you blame other people, you often think that it's a conspiracy. So a lot of people believe in conspiracy theories. A lot of people are skeptical of what the government tells them. The government of the United States is telling people you should be vaccinated. Well, what do we have? About 60% of the people in this country vaccinated, maybe 40%. 40% of 330 million is over 120 million people are not vaccinated. So I think they don't believe that what the government is telling them, or a variety of other reasons they may not be vaccinated. But so it's a challenge, and it's not easy being a government leader these days, because it's much harder to get bipartisanship than it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Speaking of service to the country, there's a guy named Jack Jacobs, and he's a Medal of Honor recipient. He volunteered for military service. He went to Vietnam in 1969. His team was ambushed by the Viet Cong, and he sustained a severe head wound. And he ultimately saved a bunch of lives from his group, fellow soldiers, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor, which is the nation's highest military honor. From your work, I think people who serve and do work like that are obviously they're heroes. They're amazing. They're far more brave than I've ever been, and show more courage. Why do you think people are willing to die for their country?
Well, that's why I interviewed Jack Jacobs. He was one of the two living Jewish Medal of Honor recipients. As a nice Jewish boy in New Jersey, his mother expected him to go to law school or medical school. And he said, no, I'm going to the military. She said, are you crazy? You're going to get killed. But he went over there, and he almost did get killed, and survived, saved people. He went back after he came out of the hospital with his injuries. He went back and volunteered again, and almost got killed again. Why do people do it? Well, he said, that's why I interviewed him. Why do people willing to give up their life? It's an interesting phenomenon. People say, nobody says, I'm going to give up my life. I'm prepared to give up my life for my neighborhood. I'm going to give up my life for my school. I'm going to give up my life for my state. But people say, I'm prepared to give up my life for my country. And obviously, millions of Americans have done that, what Lincoln called the last full measure of devotion to their country. So when people are willing to sacrifice their life for their country, it's obviously, it raises questions, why? And in the end, Jack Jacobs said, well, it wasn't so much the country, though he obviously was a citizen of the country and wanted to protect the country. It was he had developed close relationships with his colleagues. And many people I've talked to who have won Medal of Honor kind of citations say it's really you bond with your colleagues in the military, and you're trying to save their lives because they're your friends, your colleagues, your comrades, as opposed to a bigger, I'm going to do something for my country at that point where you're under attack. So Jack Jacobs is somebody I admired, and I put him in the book because I just wanted to kind of illustrate why it is that people are prepared to give their lives for the country. And sadly, so many people have.
Do you think that's changing?
I think, well, we have a strange situation right now because we don't have conscription. The people that go into the military are really probably from one small percentage of the population. They tend to now be people who are from not particularly highly educated families. They are from certain parts of the country. They tend to be a higher percentage of minorities than you have in the country as a whole. And so people who are wealthy or middle class generally are not going into the military that much. Therefore, you have a very small segment of the population defending the rest of the whole country. It's a strange situation. Israel is the opposite. Everybody has to go in and serve, and other countries have conscription. We don't have it for all the reasons that you're familiar with, the problems we had in the Vietnam War and so forth. But I do think it's a phenomenon where people are prepared to save their colleagues in giving up their life, and it's an interesting phenomenon. I don't know what you would do or I would do if we're in a foxhole and are you going to save your colleagues, save yourself? Are you doing this for your country, and why?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. I claim that I would have got involved if I didn't go to college on a football scholarship, but it's easy to say that. It's another thing to actually go and do it, and so that's why I admire the people who raise their hand and do.
So do I. Look, people would say, well, you're David Rubenstein, you're a good patriot because you're giving away money, you're fixing the Washington Monument. But look, that's easy to do relative to volunteering to give up your life.
Right.
That's a much more patriotic act. And obviously those families that have lost their children, I mean, you can never recover that. You just can't come back from that. And so particularly when you have tragedies like the Afghanistan exit, 13 people were killed in the last day or so as we're exiting by a suicide type bomb. And, maybe it was preventable or not, but you really have to go through life and thinking about what would have happened if that didn't happen, how much better those people's lives would be if their children had come back.
Yeah. Switching gears a bit, I read, and let me know if it's true, as you can't trust everything you read, but I read that you had the opportunity to invest in Facebook very early, and Mark Zuckerberg personally. What happened there? Well,
my now son-in-law was a Harvard college classmate and actually a prep school classmate of Mark Zuckerberg. And he told me about this person when he was dating my daughter. They're now married. And I said, well, this sounds like a dating service, which frankly is what Facebook was. And I said, look, in the 1960s or 70s, there were a lot of computer dating services, and they all kind of went bankrupt. And so, no, he told me at the time that Mark Zuckerberg was trying to raise a modest amount of money. And then I think he was trying to get $30,000 or something like that. And the person who did put in the $30,000, one of Mark's classmates, I think that stock's now worth 15 or $17 billion, something like that. So in those days, I was not adventuresome enough to try that kind of thing, and I didn't really bite on it, but I regret it, of course.
Did you actually look into it? Did you study him? Did you meet him? Did you do any of that?
I did not meet him. My son-in-law to be was willing to introduce me, but I just said, look, I'm meeting a college kid. I mean, come on, a college kid isn't going to do this. And of course, the Bill Gates story wasn't one that was that well known then either.
Do you regret that?
Well, of course, I wish that I had made the good investment decision. I'd have more money to give away. And, every day I think about the investments that I should have made. I walked away from so many of them that I had in the beginning. And even recently, I just walked away from something there. I had a chance to invest in a company called Rivian, which is now worth about $150 billion. And I said, I don't think this is going to get anywhere. So that was a mistake.
New electric car company, pretty amazing. Yeah. How do you think about regret now? Last time we spoke, and this kind of goes hand in hand, you said you give everything away, every last penny for to be 1 year younger, which I found interesting. You said, yeah, because it's time. Time's more important than anything, which I think is good from a perspective standpoint, David, why I want to resurface this when it comes to regret and just the way you look at life. Is there's this multi-billionaire who's giving tons and tons of money away to everybody, would give every last nickel away to be my age, to be older than me, to be older than, you know what I mean? And that, in a way, I mean, that makes me rich, right? Because I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, but I have the age that you wish you were. And I think that's an interesting perspective for people to think about.
You know, I one time I asked Bill Gates that, would you give away all your money if you could live, 5 more years? And I think humorously, he said to me something like, well, could we negotiate 10 years or something like that? So look, everybody wants to live longer, assuming you don't have gigantic health problems and it's not painful to live and all that. But of course, I would give away all my money if I could live another year. Why not? I mean, what's the point of being dead with more money? So of course, but clearly, we don't have that option. It's an interesting phenomenon, the way life has worked out. For whoever created life and things on Earth, they didn't create life in a way where it says, okay, you are going to live 60 years, 70 years, 80 years. Everybody gets to live the same amount. Why don't we have it that way? Why didn't everybody get to live exactly the same amount? And then, we don't have happenstance about you have health or bad health or whatever. But that's not the way the world works. It's a matter of luck. In my own case, I've been relatively lucky in my health, but you never know. Friends of mine are dying all the time. My age, I'm 72 now. When I read the obituaries, I see people dying of 65, 68, 70. I say, how come I'm lucky and how come they weren't? And as you know, when you have a body that has been with you your whole life, all of a sudden you've got these body parts, and one part is going to say, I'm checking out of here. I've got cancer. I've got this problem and that problem, and you just don't know how that's going to come about. And, you just have to live your life assuming that these things aren't going to happen.
What I find really inspiring about you, there's a lot of things, Dave, and why I wanted to do this again, is your endless fascination of people. And I think your curiosity towards wanting to ask them questions and wanting to learn from others, when you could very easily say, hey, look what I've done. I kind of got this thing figured out, right? And yet you are kind of the opposite in that regard of trying to learn more from other people. So your curiosity is inspiring to me. And so I almost just want to deconstruct that element of your personality selfishly to help me. I'm wondering, when you think about people and questions and what to ask them, whether it's, on a formal interview that you're on stage and you're on TV, or you're just talking to them, what is it about people that you find so fascinating? And then secondly, what are some of your favorite questions to ask people when you talk to them?
Well, let me ask the last part first. I guess, one of my favorite questions is, did your parents live to see your success? Because I think it's very important for people to make their parents proud. And, sometimes parents didn't live long enough. And interestingly, when I've ever asked that question, people light up because they say, yes, my parents did see my success, and that makes them very proud. And then I'd like to ask people, what were the struggles they had overcoming childhood problems or challenges they might have had? And people are willing to talk about that. And so I generally like to probe how somebody's life evolved. Everybody has a different story, and everybody is willing to talk about it, within reason. So the most famous word and the most common word in the English language is I, because people talk about themselves. And so if you can get people interested in talking about themselves, I think you've got an interesting conversation, because everybody wants to compare themselves with somebody else. Why do people watch interviews? Why do they watch interviews? They watch and listen to interviews because they want to see how somebody else did what they did. and maybe they can compare themselves to what another person did. An interesting phenomenon, I think we talked about this last time, is the interview format is relatively novel. For most of organized history, we didn't have interviews. So we don't have interviews with Shakespeare or great figures of history. But now we have interviews, and we can dissect people in the way we just like a CAT scan can dissect a body, you can now dissect people through an interview process, and therefore the information about a people is now available to people. You can read these interviews, and people are fascinated by interviews because they can see how somebody did something that they might have wanted to do or they would like to try to do.
I love some of those questions. What is it about parents that are so important to you that makes you want to go there?
Well, I was an only child, so I had a closer relationship with my parents than probably somebody that may have been one of 7 or 8 or 9 children. I don't know. I wasn't in a large family, but in the end, when you think about it, parents are people that create, usually, given the conventional methods that people use to create children, they create these children out of whole cloth. They create these children, and then they want to raise them. And if you look at the animal kingdom outside of humans, you see other mammals that have the same kind of nurturing process. They kind of create these children. They know they're their children, and they're kind of nurturing them. They're weaning them. They're training them, and then they ultimately, at some point, they say, "Okay, you can live on your own." And the process of creating a human and then trying to nurture that human and creating somebody that might do something great. I mean, suppose you're the mother or father of somebody who discovered a great thing that won a Nobel Prize, or you were a great leader of peace or something like that. So I think it's a interesting phenomenon. And while not everybody's a parent, I think a lot of people who are parents recognize that it's one of the most interesting and challenging things you can do in life.
The part of your question was, did your parents live to see your success? How do you define success?
Well, usually if I'm interviewing somebody, they probably are reasonably successful. So I would say I would define success as other people are telling you that you've done something useful, you have achieved things that other people admire. I don't regard success as just having piled up a lot of money, because that's not that challenging or interesting relative to having other people think you've done useful things for society. So I think we give out awards. Interestingly, we give out awards for people who have done things to help other people. The Nobel Prizes are an interesting example. They're maybe the most famous prize. There is no Nobel Prize for the wealthiest person on the earth. Mr. Nobel didn't say, whoever is the wealthiest person who made the most money in a given year, we're going to give you a Nobel Prize. Why? Because just accumulating money doesn't seem like it's that useful. It's helping other people and doing things that help other people's lives. That is what we kind of respect. And that's why the Nobel Prizes, or all other prizes of any consequence, are things that designed to help other people, not be designed to kind of point out how wealthy you are.
How much do you need kind of the affirmation of other people to feel like you've been successful?
You mean me, or generally?
Yeah,
anyone?
you.
Well, I probably, at this point, I think I've had more than enough of it. So I kind of shy away from people. I don't really like to get honors. When people say they want me to be honored for them, I generally try to avoid it, because I'm embarrassed about a lot of these things. And, the same with, a lot of kind of awards, dinners.
Why are you embarrassed by it?
Well, because people will get up and talk about how great you are, and it's embarrassing to listen to it, because you're not as good as they're going to say you are. So I'd much rather give an award out and talk about somebody than actually get an award myself. And so I just, at some point, it's embarrassing. Now, when my mother was alive, I was more willing to accept these awards, because she liked to listen there and have people say how great I was, and she actually believed it. But I now that she's passed away, I kind of have less interest in it, and my children have zero interest in listening to anybody say something good about me, because children are different than mothers.
I don't know. I think at times they think it's cool, probably. When did your mom pass away?
About 5 years ago.
So she got to see a ton of your success and accomplishments.
She did, and I would say that she was proud, because I was her only child. But interestingly, I think I may have said this before. When she did pass away, I went through all of her possessions, and the things that she kept, all the newspaper articles about me were the ones that are related to the philanthropy I've given. All the things about Carlisle success or money I've made, she didn't keep any of that, because she wasn't that concerned about that. She was more interested in my giving away money than in making money, even though she never had any money herself of any consequence.
What advice do you give to young people, 22, 23, 20, like fresh out of college? What's like general life advice you give to them?
My advice is find something you enjoy in life and pursue it. It will take you a number of years to find it. I didn't find it till I was 37. Experiment, try different things, continuously read, keep your mind open to new ideas all the time, get along with people, try to respect other people's feelings, try not to take all the credit for things, always be ethical, try not to take the path of least resistance. It can come back to haunt you in terms of ethical kinds of things. And in the end, enjoy life, because life is relatively short. We're on the earth for 80, 90 years or so, and you've got to find a way to enjoy it. Otherwise, what's the point of living?
And what qualities do you look for in a great friend?
Well, somebody that is willing to listen to, your, problems you might have, or somebody who might have advice for you, people that are willing to support you, do things to help you, do favors for you when you need a favor. Those are kind of things that you have. And, all of us have made friends throughout our life. I have some friends I've kept from high school or junior high school. I still, socialize with. And sometimes I've met people just a couple of months ago, and I find them as interesting as well to be friends with.
Are people who knew you when you were in middle school and high school surprised, or are they like, no, I'm not surprised that David would do what he's done?
Well, privately they probably are, but publicly they won't probably say that. I don't know. But, look, I was a modestly intelligent person, not a great athlete, not a student body president, nothing that was anything to write home about. So, yes, I think privately they would probably say, hey, how did this happen? Yeah, sure, probably. But, you go back and look, as I've said in my leadership book, it's rarely the case that people who succeed in life when they're 50s or 60s are people who were superstars in their teenage years. The Rhodes Scholars of the world, they often fade. The student body presidents, what happened to them? I've looked back and where it happened to some of the student body presidents in my schools, and, they never accomplished that much, relatively speaking. Some people have done great things throughout life, but generally you find people have phases, and you get lucky in life if you are not a superstar early on, but become more successful later in life.
What do you think of imposter syndrome? Do you ever have that? And if so, like, what advice do you give to people who suffer from that?
What do you mean? People are saying they're.
So I get a lot of questions, like somebody, maybe they get promoted to a leadership role, and maybe they're young or they're not ready, and they're like, oh God, I don't know what I'm doing. Or sometimes even speaking in front of a group, you look around, you're like, I shouldn't be on this stage. These other people are far smarter. Like I've definitely felt it. Is that something you've ever felt? And if so, how do you deal with it?
Well, sometimes I'm on a panel and I realize the other people on the panel are much more accomplished than me, or sometimes people will introduce me with words that are too embarrassing, and I will try to deflect it by saying, now I know who I should give my eulogy, because I'd like to hear that at my funeral or something like that. But generally, I would say I'm embarrassed that people think I'm better than I think I am myself, but at this point, I've kind of accepted the reality that some people will say better things about me than I would say about myself.
So it's not really a thing that you deal with?
Probably not.
What would you get? What advice you give to another young person who was like facing that fear right now? I'm not worthy. I don't know if I belong. I don't know.
I would say, well, I would not try to just tell somebody young, hey, you're not that great. I want young people to keep striving and to feel that they can live up to what people might think, but just recognize, don't let it go to your head, because most likely you're going to have some setbacks in life, as I did. And then if you think you're the greatest thing in the world and you have setbacks, you're not going to be as willing to and able to overcome them. People that overcome challenges are people that have struggled in life and don't have such a big view of themselves. If you have such a big view of yourself and you fail, you may not be able to pick yourself up and get back on the game.
That's a good point. David, this I'm really appreciative of you continuously publishing
Right.
this work. Are you going to stick to this schedule of aggressively publishing more
Yes.
and more books?
Well, I have a book coming out next year. It's on investing. I've interviewed what I think are the greatest investors in the world, and it's a little different than leadership, but it's about how you can, invest money. And everybody is now an investor in one form or another. You might be the greatest investor in the world, or you might be a modest investor, but everybody's interested in investing, and so that's what my next book will be about.
So all your books do they usually stem from your interviews that you publish, that you share?
Some of the initial ones were interviews I did, and then I put them back together. Now what I'm doing is I'm doing interviews just for a book. For example, I did these interviews for the investing book just for the book. And so it's a little different. And then after that, I probably will get out of the interview format just because I want to show that I can do a book that isn't just a bunch of interviews compiled together. So I'm working on a couple other things, but we'll see. One of the ideas I may have mentioned to you before is I have thought about another interview book that I'm interested in, which is to go back and do interviews with people like Cleopatra, Shakespeare, Napoleon, and basically kind of reconstruct what they would do with an interview. And I can't decide if I should do it myself or I'll answer the questions or get an expert who's an expert in Napoleon who could play the role of Napoleon and answer the questions the way he would answer them. Anyway, I'm working on that.
That would be pretty cool. So when you do these interview books, how do you interview? Do you do it like on Zoom? Like, what's your process? How do you
I used to do them in person. Now I do a lot by Zoom because it's much more convenient. But I still will happily go and do an interview in person if somebody wants that.
And then just record it and either publish it or not, or just publish it in the book, or depends.
Well, that's a trick. Sometimes you do interview and then ultimately the publisher says there's not enough room for all these interviews. So I have to go back to people and say, well, thanks for doing the interview, but I can't put it in the book. So
yeah, no, I'm just fascinated, but also by your writing process and kind of gathering so much knowledge from subject matter experts or people who have lived these extraordinary lives, and then finding the through line for the purpose of a book, I think is really cool. I'm really grateful that you do it.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks again for coming back, and I would love to obviously have you every time.
All right, thanks a lot. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, David. All right.
Bye.